Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Just to introduce myself, I am Najib Mohammed Al-Ali, the Executive Director of the Expo 2020 Dubai. Before we start a fruitful discussion, perhaps I'm going to take you a little bit on a journey back. 1851, in a place not too far from here. The whole World Exposition actually started in this place, with a history more than 160 years. At a time where communication was not so easy, if you wanted to know the latest that is out there, you needed to come to an expo. If you wanted to meet the people, you needed to come to an expo. Things progressed fast. Many inventions actually came about expos. Broadcasts. My favorite product, ketchup. Many important things in life actually came in an expo. Fast forwarding to these days, you might think, and some people actually say, you no longer need an expo. If something is invented in Japan, you will know it, not next day, you will know it the same day. So is it the time to actually still go and do an expo? We actually say yes. It's not only about figuring something out online, whether it exists or not. It's about that human connection that you actually need with an expo. And that's why we actually have a World Expo today, next year in 2020 in Dubai. And we believe in that platform where we get people together. That togetherness is such an important thing in today's life. We believe in it, and we say that with the Expo 2020, and we have 190 countries so far actually participating and taking part, that this is actually the last international forum or exhibition that is actually celebrating future, celebrating humanity together. And with our Expo, the idea is that we are actually building this exhibition together. It's not only a Dubai or a UAE thing. It's actually getting all the countries together, working together to be able to give something new. We are a new country, a young country. We're talking with His Excellency about our first participation, 1970, where we actually had our first participation in Osaka. It was a platform where we were able to celebrate the new country. It was the first platform that our leaders were able to go out and talk about our unity. And this was a year and 2 months before the country was actually created. Fast forwarding 50 years from Osaka, we are actually hosting the World Exhibition in our country, in Dubai. So it was a journey as far as from Osaka to Dubai. And perhaps we can think of it as a journey from Abu Dhabi to Dubai. And with that, I would like to also introduce my co-host, His Excellency Bilhol, the UAE ambassador here in London, to say a few words before we start the conversation. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. One of my first engagements so soon after taking my post at such high-level event and such excitement before in the lead up to Expo. Majlises have played a big part in our culture, and Majlis obviously means to sit and gather, which is what we're doing here today. And I believe our leaders were, Najib references the 1970 and our first participation before the union was signed, and I think that was so progressive, in fact, the thoughts our leaders were thinking about. But I think we were, in that part of the world, the Majlis was using connecting the minds and creating the future. And if you look at the UAE, that's certainly been the case. And so, long back, I mean, you have to commend the effectiveness of Majlises and the ability to come up with ideas, to solve problems. So for us, it's, the Majlis is huge significance. And it's just, something that I think is a real, maybe an unsung success story of our culture in that part of the world. I going to Majlis as a young boy, from my uncles or with cousins, right up to having the privilege to go to the Sheikh's Majlises, was something that was really, is really ingrained in our culture, and that openness, that transparency, that ability to, for people of all walks of life, all creeds to come and sit with one another, exchange ideas, as well as connect with their leaders, is such an important important channel of a healthy society. And it's obviously become more challenging as the place gets bigger, but from my childhood I have those days, and I think it was always something, people had a lot of enthusiasm, and it provided enthusiasm before big festivals like Eid. And so for me, the Majlis, and we're here, sat here today, obviously with some brilliant minds, and I'm so humbled to have been asked to speak as well, because but that's my take on it, and I'm so excited, so humbled to be the UA ambassador to the UK. There's so much, I believe, that can be done and achieved, and I look forward to working with you all to write the next pages of our history. And thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Not to take too much of your time, we would like to get directly into the conversation, and I'd like to hand over to, I think many of you might know her. I definitely followed the program on BBC Click, but LJ, I think you can also introduce yourself, and LJ will be coordinating the Majlis session today, and hopefully it will be a fruitful one for all of us.
My name's LJ Rich. I present technology on the BBC, a show called Click. I travel the world, experiencing innovations everywhere from somebody's shed to like some of the top companies that you're probably all really familiar with. So today we're headed towards shared virtual worlds, simulations, AI-enabled technology scenarios. And it's the perfect time to ask, what is reality after all? So I'm really excited to invite all of you, participants and observers alike, to today's Majlis Beyond Reality. Right now, we're doing something really special. We're sitting in the same room physically together, just like you were saying. And, you know, this is a luxury right now, because in the future, things could be a bit different. You could be a paid model to sit there with somebody else's face. Sorry, not a paid model. You could be a paid model. Hang on, what do I know? You could be a paid model, sir, with somebody else's face projected onto you. You will stand in for them. They can basically have a meeting with you there. You could be a robot that someone is controlling virtually, remotely from the other side of the planet. I could be a hologram. No one is surprised at that. But today is about trying to make sense of the future. And technology, I think, has come about because people like us want to be connected with something bigger, with each other. On the end of most technology is another human being. So today is about what happens when reality and technology mix. And this is an informal conversation. Forget the microphones. Let's leave our titles and qualifications behind as well. Please feel free to lean in, comment, engage, and towards the end we'll open the floor to the observers for a few questions. I think today is going to be unlike any other public conversation I've ever been a part of, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about what everyone thinks. In order to really kick off, what we're going to do is have a small introduction to three areas: world future, government, society and ethics, and art and creativity. They are gigantic areas. But the idea is that you can pretty much put your hand up and start and continue the conversation. And please approach this in the spirit of good-natured, respectful debate, but really get into it. And I will try and keep the conversation around those three areas. In order to do this, I'm going to ask three people to start this Majlis off, beginning with Rob Auten, the CEO of Hexagram, who's going to give us his thoughts on the future, just a small kind of subject to get things started. Rob, you've already built a kind of mirror world, which we'll explain a bit more of about that in a second. But you had an interactive novel game hybrid which existed in real life as well as in this sort of in fictional virtual reality game world. And we're going to probably get into this a bit more. But Rob, I think you'd be a brilliant person to give us your perspective on what your thinking is for the next decade or so.
Sure. I mean, I think well, it's interesting because maybe I'll start a little bit by just talking about sort of what the mirror world is, because I think that might help contextualize some of this. the phrase mirror world came about mostly in a book that was written in, I think, 1991 by a professor at Yale named David Gelernter. And he, I have the quote, he said that someday soon, in 1991, you will look into a computer screen and see reality. And by his definition, 30-odd years, or almost 30 years later, we're there in that we live in a world of data. And what I think has come to pass in recent years is that the level of fidelity and the ways in which this data talks to other pieces of data, that we now are able to look into a screen and see a version of reality thanks to the networking and the sensors and all the things that are enabling that information to appear on our screen. And I think what we're going to see in the next decade, and what's kind of already starting, is that the data is now going to come out of the screens and will look into reality through a screen, right? And I think so that there'll be that visualization of this data. You might look at a building and see, you could look at a hotel and see how many rooms are available and at what price and what locations, and so you'd know which one you wanted before you walk in the door. We live in a world where already our smart homes know that we're coming into the driveway and start the air conditioning. It's a very American example. But so I think that transition and sort of this new definition of mirror world that we're seeing coming to pass, if anybody saw, there was a cover article in Wired 2 or 3 months ago, is this visualization and this integration of the data around us and the world in which we live.
Brilliant. Let's also hear from someone who can talk about our second topic, government, society and ethics. Shall we call on Lord Clement Jones to give a few, this is a little bit of a surprise, but just a few thoughts on where you think government, society and ethics might be in the next few years?
Wow, that's a very big question. And because, of course, technology itself is value-free. And so when you're looking at technology, you have to look at the societal implications of that technology. And one of the heartening things that I found when I went to the World Government Summit in Dubai, and then later the AI Everything Summit, was that the subject matter of ethics was to the forefront. Because I think it's very straightforward in terms of talking about the opportunities for AI, in many ways, and virtual reality, and the other aspects, Internet of Things. A combination of all those technologies really has huge implications, not just simply as to whether or not they're going to benefit society, but also in terms of the biases that they may introduce as a result of using the wrong data sets, as a result of the lack of explainability that may be there, because the algorithms used are rather opaque. And a variety of other aspects, such as how diverse is the workforce in terms of the ability to understand that the algorithms that one is using and the data sets one is using are actually biased. And then there's a whole series of other implications as one goes forward, looking at the ethics and the application. For instance, who is actually going to get most of the benefit in the future out of new technologies? Distributive justice itself is going to be rather important. Already people have talked about universal basic income. I'm not a great believer in that necessarily at this stage, but we certainly need to think about what happens if, by and large, new technology is substitutional rather than augmentative or assistive. I'm very much in favour of the latter, but if it turns out, the Osborne and Frey forecast that it's going to be something, between 40 and 70% of jobs at risk from things like artificial intelligence, we really need to start thinking about, what are the implications of that, reskilling and so on and so forth. So, and then who gets the benefit from, if you like, the fruits of the new technology. So there are a lot of implications for all our societies, both here and in the UAE and in the US, and already people are thinking about that, but we're in a little bit of a race against time. And the only thing I would say is that, in finishing the remarks there, is that AI and other technologies really do have to be our servant, not our master. So we really have to get there in thinking about these issues pretty much now.
Brilliant. I can see everybody getting ready to join in, so this is great. We're going to get one more person to give us a perspective on art and creativity. So let's involve Devlin in this. Please, what do you think is in store for artists, creatives, yourself in the next 10 years or so?
What I'd like to do, actually, if you don't mind, is just tell a little story. A story that began 20 years ago in this art gallery. I visited this art gallery 20 years ago. I didn't know what I was coming to see, but there was a room full of sweets, silver sweets, and it was the extraordinary artist Felix Gonzalez Torres having an exhibition here. He knew he was dying of HIV at the time, and he was making art that everybody could take. And the spirit of that work was that everybody took one of the silver sweets away with them. 20 years later, I was invited to make a piece of work at the Serpentine Gallery on the occasion of the Serpentine Gala. I wanted to somehow honor my first experience. I wanted to make a piece of work that everybody could take away with them. But I wanted also to make a piece of work that everybody could create together. I didn't know how to do this, but some algorithm writers helped me who were working with Google Arts and Culture. And we created together an algorithm that allowed every single guest at the Serpentine Gala to donate one word. And by the end of the evening, we had a collective poem. And everybody took a fragment of it away with them. And that piece of work has now blossomed into the model that you see over on this side of the tent that we're sitting under by Zaha Hadid. And that spirit of everybody being able to add one word and a collective poem has now become a building, which we'll be showing as part of the Dubai Expo, which is incredibly exciting. But yeah, it all came from that spirit of how can we connect our minds. I didn't go out there thinking, how can I use a piece of machine learning? Because my work isn't driven by what technology can I use. The word technology, as we know, comes from the Greek tech, which was just, at the beginning, to weave. It was the first technology, textile. That's all it meant, it's just weaving. So I wasn't thinking about how I could use technology. I was thinking about how could I connect people, and somebody help me make a piece of technology that would do that work. And I think you're absolutely right that it's all about what machine do we need to help us make the statement or the gesture that we want to make, rather than working the other way around.
So technology is a lever as well as everything else. So would anyone like to pick up on any of these topics right now? Art and culture, society, government and ethics, or just generally the future? Can I see any hands? Yes, you were first.
Brambilla, about arts and culture. I think what Az was saying earlier about using technology as an enabler and engaging the senses in a way that's completely new. And that's only something we've been able to do very recently, because we're engaging more and more senses now. Like the playback you had at the beginning obviously was about less is more. Now more is more, with virtual reality, with interactive video and immersive installations, which is something I've worked on for quite some time. And I remember my first experience in VR. I was shooting a demonstration for Nokia that had just built the first VR camera. And we had 9 little girls around the camera forming a daisy chain. And I couldn't look at it physically. I had to be in another room to see what they were doing and to be able to direct them. And I was wearing the headset. So unbeknownst to me, halfway through the day, they played back a rehearsal, and I entered the frame while I'm watching it in VR from ground level, looking up at these girls. And I nearly jumped out of my skin. And this was the power of that technology 3 years ago in terms of connecting your visual sense and your nervous system at the same time. And I realized this is a really powerful medium. I think it has a lot of potential.
I asked the guys at Frame Store, the people who won the special effects Oscar for Gravity, and we were talking about VR a few years ago, and I said, well, how many frames per second is real life? Because TV is 25 still pictures in a line, and I thought it would be quite high. Can we, does anyone think it was more than 200 frames a second, real life? More than 100 frames a second? It's 95 frames per second.
It's 120 for...
It's 120
yeah,
for...
yeah. But that's what the standard is now for VR and AR. It's 120 frames per second.
But we cannot distinguish real life from 95 frames per second. That's what they reckon the threshold was.
Right.
And then the next thing is latency. So what you were talking about, where you were in that area with the 9 girls, we're getting to a point where we can't really, our stupid human bodies, our puny human minds are really easily tricked, aren't they? Does anyone want to come in on that? Yes. Hi.
Martin Rees, Space Science, Cambridge. I think we've got to bear in mind that the one big change is the speed at which technology is advancing. Our children and grandchildren have very different lives from ours, and the interconnectedness of the world. And I think we've got to realize that everything we've talked about so far is really icing on the cake. There's some real problems of ensuring that we don't have huge parts of the world, especially Africa, left behind. And it'll be even worse if they know what they're missing, because they'll have these techniques before they have sanitation and proper food. And this is a real recipe for disaffection, and the population there is growing soon. So I do think we should realize we're focusing on the icing on the cake, not the real problems in discussing this topic.
If I may just echo Lord Rees's comments there, I think what's notable about the author of Mirror Worlds is he was also one of the victims of Ted Kaczynski's Unabombing campaign, one of the most high-profile ones. And so that is not, I think, a dissimilar sentiment that as most people experience these extraordinary breakthroughs in technology, it actually comes part and parcel with a profound sense of anxiety and disconnection, because they are not the ones that are making it, nor do they fully understand it. And so that in many ways is going to be one of the crucial challenges of the 21st century. How do we engage people in a conversation about this technology that they feel part of and that they actually have some agency in? And I realized I didn't introduce myself. I'm Noah Raford from the Dubai Future Foundation and the Museum of the Future. And the reason I think this is relevant is as we create more public engagement about technology, if we do not address this sense of disaffection, anxiety, and indeed resistance that has risen, given birth to populist movements around the world, including this country, then all of our efforts will be for naught.
I'll continue on the segue on that thought. Rabia Dabusi from Dark Matter, we're the cybersecurity provider for Expo. We live in an age where we're facing tech tension as individuals, as organizations, and as governments and nations. And the UAE, as Najib said earlier, is a young nation, progressive, has done a tremendous amount of innovation and digitization in what we do. But what we're seeing is a phenomenon of tech tension. In one hand, you're actually excited about the technology and the value technology brings, but on the other hand, you're very hesitant and anxious about the use of that technology. And we all have to focus as community and organizations on easing that tension. And our focus is on making sure that we build resilience in the systems and the platforms and the technologies that we deploy in our environment. You could take this as an individual, an owner of a home. You want to digitize your door, your front door, but at the same time you say, what if someone hacks into my digital lock and replicate my fingerprint or retina scan or whatever it is and gets into my house? That concern exists at larger scale. I think as a community, our job is to make sure we pay a bigger attention, because the level of attack, the severity of the attack, and the pace of attack continues to increase. Unfortunately, in the UAE, we're facing a disproportionately higher level of cyber attacks than what we face in other nations. 3% of all global cyber attacks are targeted to the UAE, which is very significant. And we're facing a lot of challenges on the impact of those potential risks. So I want to make sure as a community, excited about technology, excited about virtual reality, excited about the replicas, the avatars, all the different technologies, that we pay attention to the potential risk associated with it, and we seek advice on that.
So we're looking at engagement and we're looking at risk. Does anyone want to come in on ideas for how we can approach that? How do we get people interested?
I mean, if you look at the difference in the UK between how human fertilization and embryology technology, in a sense, was accepted, and the difference between that and the way that GM foods technology was not accepted. You know, the way that governments dealt with that was very different, and the way that business, in a sense, made the argument for GM foods was really, didn't give any indication that this was going to be good for the consumer. It was always seen as being good for the company developing the technology. So how you win public trust in a particular technology very much depends how you get across the benefits as well and the ethical development of it. So, you know, there are some precedents out there, and it's building that narrative, and because people live on narratives, and we've already started to get some unhelpful narratives, in a sense, about things like artificial intelligence. The first instinct of a newspaper is often to put, you know, a Terminator robot on the front page whenever you're talking about AI, whereas, of course, all of us around this room know that there's a very big difference, you know. It's not all about robots. It's not all about embedded technology.
I'd also say that culturally, though, in the West, it's more likely to put the Terminator robot, but if you go over to Japan, for example, the robot as companion is a massive thing, and there's so much advance going on in the world of robotics and healthcare. They built a robot using sort of systems integration and an existing robot to not only cook octopus balls, but also to do nails. And at first that sounds really frivolous. Why would you teach a robot how to do nails until you realise that the error margin is 0.1 millimetres to be able to paint nails, and it takes humans quite a long time to learn how to do it. And you know, it's really fascinating. They're looking into using that for healthcare, and I guess it would be quite good to bring in somebody who's got experience in this virtual surgery world. Where do you think we're going in terms of mirror world? Can you see yourself performing a surgery on the other side of the world, if the connection is fast enough?
So Shafi Ahmed, surgeon in London. Absolutely, it's happened already actually. This is not a future kind of thing. So about 3 months ago, using 5G technology, there was a surgeon in the eastern province of China who did a robotic operation remotely 30 miles away. Using, and we know 5G is high speed, low latency of 0.1 millisecond. So we've seen that already. Actually, tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Vodafone are releasing their 5G kind of ambition in the UK. But going back to the question about this real reality and working in new worlds, healthcare itself needs to change, needs to be disrupted. We can't afford healthcare as it is. It's too expensive. And for me, the most expensive part is this relationship, a human-to-human contact. It's so expensive. I'm expensive, what I do. Not as expensive as I should be, but I am expensive. But if I'm going to take that away, because at the moment the GDPs are going up, we can't afford it, it's not accessible, it's unaffordable. I'm experimenting with holograms, avatars, telepresence systems, new ways of managing virtual humans. So the question is, would you be happy with a doctor who's remote? There might be an AI interface who's a virtual human, who speaks like you, looks like you, has empathy perhaps. So that's really a question we have to ask our society. Are you ready? Because that's the only way we democratize access to healthcare. It's AI chatbot, whether it's a virtual human that's empathic, or even remote surgery. So these are really fundamental questions we have to ask ourselves. And I did the world's first VR operation back in 2016, where I streamed live an operation across the globe in 360, and it was watched by millions of people. So that people are ready for this change. And the last thing I would like to say about the question around, are we ready? Well, there's something called social re-engineering. This is really important. We're the innovators, the early adopters. We're here by default. How do you take that journey with the patients, with the end user? And that's the discussion we need to have. How do you promote that in a way that's empathic, that's ethical, that takes them on a journey so we can embrace this technology and kind of impact and implement it? And that's a government-down approach, I feel.
So this sounds to me like there's a big question of PR. It doesn't really matter so much about the technology as long as you can get the right message.
And I think there's an element of PR, but these are tectonic times. We've never been so interconnected, and yet we have not been so fractured as a world since the 1930s. We've never been so able to communicate, and yet so unable to collaborate. We have not for a long time seen a globalizing force in one hemisphere and a deglobalizing force, as Harvard called this move in the West, on the other. So the Belt and Road on one side and our nationalist focus on the other. And I think that my perspective on it is around justice. I don't want to talk about ethics. Using facial recognition to stop bad people might be universal, but how one does it creates ethical challenges. So I'm not going to talk about ethics. But I'm going to talk about justice. Because if we universalize our relationship, we move away from a boundary, border, barrier, tariff mentality into a virtual world. We encode our technology to take decisions for us. We use smart contracts to make business more efficient. Which court has jurisdiction? When I move my assets into Libra, which has, in my sense, as a stable coin, the opportunity to change the way we view money, which coin can attach those assets? Which court can attach those assets? Where do they exist? Which server do you serve the court order on? And does it matter if you do? So as we universalize, and technology plays an important part, what happens to justice, both for individuals, where at the moment we're protected within the domestic boundaries of our own laws, or for businesses, where our contracts are self-executing and no court has jurisdiction? I think those are important issues for us to consider alongside ethics.
I think there's somebody who might be quite well placed to talk about blockchain, decentralized transactions and trust, I guess. So, Devlin, can I bring you in, please?
Pleasure to meet everyone. Dawson from the London Stock Exchange Group. So just to kind of tie into some of your points, I mean, I think it's interesting that you brought up Libra and also kind of the cross-border or kind of pan-national considerations around some of these technologies and how you interplay, you know, national governance and sovereignty against technologies that are very much, you know, beyond that. But I think some of the observations that we've seen and kind of the trends that we observe in terms of how the landscape is evolving, there's definitely a recognition of, again, just the strength of sovereignty of government. And I think, you know, even if you look at the Libra project and the backlash that they've received from regulators, from central banks, from governments, there's a view that ultimately, you know, in order for these technologies to work, in order for them to solve real-world problems and find their place in broader society, they still have to play by the rules. And it may be that, you know, being able to essentially encode those governance structures and also even leveraging blockchain, which, again, as a tool is, you know, gives you the mechanism to automate democratization or automate governance, you know, allows you to bring these parties to the table and operate those governance structures in a way that it can be done outside of the system, but also it can be done within the system through bringing those people together and streamlining those activities that need to be done in order to facilitate those decisions that need to be made.
May I have one follow-up on that? And I totally agree. I don't call it democratization insofar as that doesn't necessarily play globally. But consensual-based decision-making around governance is perfect. But you said something, to my mind, critical. Well, many things that were critical, but one thing that triggered my imagination. You said they have to play by the rules. Whose rules?
Everyone's.
And what you do when you have the rules. And if I may add, is today technology is very well understood by the designers, the engineers, the architects. It's also very well understood by people who are trying to compromise it. But then when you ask a judge, and I've had the situations where we're trying to legalize and govern certain aspects of technology, there is a missing link. There is a lost in translation approach where the populace doesn't really understand how technology works, what the technology capabilities are. And therefore, I think there has to be a shift, since we're talking about society, in the way we educate our children from the younger age, because you want them to fully understand the capacity and capabilities and potential of technology, because ultimately they will have to regulate it and set the laws and rules for it.
So, Faulkner, UK as Commissioner for Dubai World Expo. I'm listening to lots of different stories struggling with one point, and that is how, and how we actually translate the solutions or the innovations that you have into the future and into the youth, which obviously is a key theme of Expo. I want to share a story with you and then give you a thought. And the story is 18 months ago, we were looking as the UK government at telling a story of innovation and trying to do it cross-border. So without borderless, I hear you absolutely clearly. industries from across the UK, multi-sector, be it space, be it AI, be it however you define yourselves, came together and said, how can we tell that story and make it relevant to the future? So we hit on a really simple thing, children. And instead of envisaging what we think we want to place towards the future, we asked children. And by children, I mean under the age of 10 years old. And we gave them free rein to ask the question, in the future, what will it look like? And it was amazing to film the answers that came out of the children. And one that sticks with me, well, two that stick with me. The first was the little boy that said, I can clap hands with another person and pay my bills. I can blink and I can see the answers to my homework because of embedding. And I mean, these are really interesting things, but they came out of the minds of the future of this planet. The most telling was the child that sat down to me and said, actually, in the future, we will teach our parents. And I thought that was a really thought-provoking message for me. So that's my story on how to approach innovation is the other way around than perhaps we look at it. My observation and my thought for everybody here is actually about Expo. The UK has interpreted the Connecting Minds, Creating the Future theme, and we've chosen the words innovating for a shared future, which Ezra so ably interpreted through AI and space and AI as a force for good into our pavilion, and that's the story we will be telling. But Expo, it strikes me, is the ultimate Majlis. And it is the ultimate opportunity with 192 countries in one place or more to convene conversations to answer some of these questions. And so the thought from London in World Majlis is that that is precisely what the United Kingdom wants to do as a contribution and as a support to help with everything that happens 1 and a little bit years' time down in Dubai when the world is in one place. We will convene conversations, and our promise is that we will bring the best of British creativity, innovation, and partnerships, for lifelong partnerships, to meet the world and continue the conversation. So in PR terms, that's my answer.
I can see there are already some questions from the floor. Hold tight for those, because I'm just going to make sure. Is there anyone here who's not had a chance to say anything yet who would like to?
It strikes me, just to kind of think about technology a little bit, the beginning with weaving, as Ed said, and now proceeding at such a pace that we can't stop and measure where it's going. You know, it's like a technology progresses at the sort of speed of a bullet or something, and with a bullet, you look for a target and you fire a target and you get there, and you don't worry about how it gets there. It's going to get there in the end. And I feel certainly kind of in my profession and kind of attitudes towards urban design but also kind of affects how cities are and how cities operate and how people live and how culture develops, but also kind of just day to day on the internet, on our mobile phones and so on. There's a sort of rudderless progression that's sort of happening minute by minute, second by second, and it feels that we need to develop in this sort of form maybe a wise kind of series of targets that we want to reach. So why technology? What are we trying to do with this technology? I understand we often use it just to make money faster. We just want to, we can do a deal quicker, we can, maybe we can help people across the other side of the world with an operation or something. But to have some, to reach some consensus on, say, in the next 10 years, we'd like technology to do this for us, which means universal access to healthcare or vaccines, or the internet's already delivered kind of, I guess, access to knowledge for a lot of people. But it just feels that rather than this kind of minute-by-minute progress, we won't get to the big targets unless we work together to kind of identify them and then achieve them.
It sounds to me like we could do with something similar to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes.
But for technology. Well, there's a group of people in this room that could probably create something to start, I would imagine. Was there somebody else who wanted to say something? Hello.
Yes, I just wanted to say I come from Africa, and I've seen lots of failed projects, you know, with the best intentions that haven't delivered what they were designed to do by those, you know, coming with the ideas. And I think from listening to what I've heard so far, the quality we have to try and develop is this notion of empathy. You know, where we've been successful with technology in Africa, it's because we've spent a lot of time on the ground really understanding how people live in very different circumstances to those which frame our worldviews. And only when you apply that kind of empathy do you have a chance of really delivering something that will be adopted, that will drive justice, that will drive a more inclusive society. So for me, empathy, and you develop that in forums like this. So I love this idea. You get a deeper understanding of how people tick.
It feels like a talking hackathon to me. This is my first Majlis, and I'm really enjoying it.
I'm Andrew Jackson, UK Consul General in Dubai, so working very closely with Laura as we think about the Expo. Three quick ones. First of all, one of the things the UAE as host has really inspired us about where this great pavilion is going to appear is the opportunity area and this idea of the opportunity to make a difference. And one of the things that we think about that would be great to have ideas that comes up is that we have the possibility to enable people to experience technologies coming to the pavilions, not just the UK pavilion, but also then to reflect upon their responsibility and their opportunity of how those technologies are used. So if the pavilions and the national participation in the Expo is about that responsibility and opportunity, it could be very interesting. The second one, because we come at it from the point of view of governments trying to make links internationally, and I think it's already come out of this discussion, that everything that we're talking about can't be governments on its own. We're always going to be talking about the research and the ideas and the technologies that are changing all the time, the businesses who drive them and making sure that they're in the room, and then, as said right at the start, the ethics, the regulation, and having that three-way discussion all of the time. And I think the third thing is that you've hit on it. If you think about how getting all of those things right impacts on global challenges and development, you really do have an opportunity to make it a genuinely global conversation of people who are excluded at the moment and can benefit from the technologies, but the sort of people around this room who have access and the ideas to those technologies to do just that. So opportunity at Expo.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I think we're all in very privileged positions, and it's very easy to think, oh, how can we do it? But part of it is, like you say, it's asking, and it's listening as well. Okay, I think you had your hand up first, and then you afterwards.
I think a lot of very interesting points have been made about the idea of what is the role of technology, and as you mentioned, what is technology doing for us, or what are the issues that we're facing, whether it's ethical or anything else, that technology, these are issues that technology is posing. So technology is solving a few problems, but it's also giving us sort of issues to address. And I think it's really important to notice when we all kind of are pointing at similar things and saying, well, there is an issue of trust, and there is an issue of responsibility, and there is an issue of regulation and ethics, and all of these things kind of come together. I think it's quite fascinating to say we've all come together and we've all identified the issue, so let's work together to address these issues. I mean, if we're talking about beyond reality, new virtual worlds, they create a whole other level of access. And as was mentioned, I hate to reference, cybersecurity issues and all of these things, but it is a reality that we need to face. But the opportunities that are there and the use cases, as have been mentioned, are fascinating. And the opportunities are too great for us to say there are obstacles, because we've already identified these obstacles. Now, the idea is to address these issues. And I think something that maybe has kind of been hinted on but not explored very deeply is this idea of authorship. If we are creating new worlds, who owns that? Who owns the information? What is in an era of fake news, what have we learned from the previous platforms that have been created? What are the issues that social media as a platform or the internet as a platform has created? Because some of these things that we're talking about, some of these virtual worlds, they're using technology that already exists. So when we put together a technology that already exists, we create this very powerful entity. So we should learn from what's been done in terms of regulating it as we know it's coming.
Brilliant, thank you. And after your comment, I'm going to open up to some of the observers who had their hands up earlier. So you were going to add?
Yeah, I went to my first Expo in 1967 in Montreal as a young boy, and I've been obsessed with Expos my whole life. I've been to maybe 4 or 5. And I remember seeing the wall in Osaka with the mist, the first projection on mist and all of that. And I think they always represented to me in my imagination this idea of it could be a premonition of utopias, of potential utopias. And then depending on the way politically, technologically, the world changes and moves, you go from one to the next, and there's a trajectory there. I think what's interesting about today is that the introduction of machine learning, artificial intelligence has removed a lot of friction from the way we communicate, the way we share ideas, the governance of those ideas. And I think all this technology really just ethically, I guess, enables our tendencies as it comes from human nature and accelerates whichever direction human nature wants to go. And I think it's a question of, do we believe in this as being a new renaissance? Do we believe that technology is releasing ideas at a faster pace and it's allowing engagement and interaction in a fundamentally different, beneficial, different way? Or do we look in a dystopic direction and think this is what could also go wrong? And I think ultimately it's really about freeing people's imagination. And that's what Expos have always represented for me, that each nation put their best foot forward and showed us a portal into a world that was always this hopeful world. And I think the technology in use today, what I like to do with technology in my artwork is certainly to celebrate this idea of reinventing reality in a way that's more aspirational, I think is interesting.
And I think it goes towards your story. I mean, I'm a futurist, which usually is a synonym for like talk a lot and do nothing outside of the UAE and China and a few corporate boardrooms. But one of the things from future studies, which is an actual academic discipline, is if you ask people what do you think your life will be like in the future, people almost uniformly say it's going to be better, it's going to be more exciting, I'm going to get to do all these wonderful things. If you ask them what do you think the world will be like in the future, they almost uniformly say it's going to be worse, it's going to be horrible, my kids are going to be cannibal corpses, whatever. And to the point about the simplicity and the emotional connection, and what I loved about the way you framed that is the difference between looking at the future as a dystopia versus looking at the future as a place which offers you the opportunity to become who you want to be and express love with others the way you want to, is your sense of connection to that. And so I think you hit the nail on the head. And I would also just say that's the difference between PR and art, or PR and storytelling. That's not something that you can spin because everyone can differentiate that from BS quite clearly, but actually telling profound stories that people can identify with, towards the gentleman from South Africa's point, that's really rare, and it does best in person. So that's why the Expo is such a special opportunity to express our common aspirations for the future together.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to you, and then we'll go to you, sir, after that.
One of the greatest minds of our time, Ez knows exactly where I'm going to go with this now, Stephen Hawking and his breakthrough project talked about unifying everyone on the planet and a common single language. And I'm listening very much to the joining forces, empathy, and I think it was literally implicit in that breakthrough project that he laid down. But part of that breakthrough project told a message, and that message was lift your eyes up, not just at the future of this planet, but look at how you would unify a single common language that you could potentially send to other civilizations. And in other words, the challenge being, do not be myopic about innovation or technology or the future. Think bigger than each individual on the planet. Think about a common goal for everyone. And Lord Rees is sitting here, and we were having a conversation just prior to the Majlis convening about space. And I would be really interested to hear his thoughts on the opportunity that presents.
Could I say, I'm not quite sure what Stephen Hawking thought, but I think it's a dangerous delusion to think that we can escape the Earth's problems by going to Mars. Very dangerous delusion. Two things. First, the case for sending people into space is getting weaker as robots get better. And the only case for sending people is if they want to go as a high-risk adventure. And I think a few will go, and then, of course, they will use all the technology of genetics and cyborg to adapt to a very hostile environment on Mars. And then they may become a new species, and then they will go off into the blue yonder. But I think mass emigration of humans to Mars is neither realistic nor desirable. It's a doddle compared to deal with climate change than to terraform Mars and make it habitable. So we should not think of mass emigration. So I think Stephen was deeply misconceived when he said that.
Can I just go for you, please, and then you in the green afterwards?
Yes. So one point that have been coming again and again today is the gap between people who are working with technology and the rest of the world, and that we are missing empathy. My argument is actually counterintuitive, where I'm saying scientists, technologists and engineers are way more progressive than policymakers. For example, based on our research, we have been working on virtual reality that would help you to empathize with the future of your decisions. And we found that to be very effective. On the other hand, we also worked on the future of work, and we found that for the first time we scientifically proven that using augmented reality and virtual reality can improve performance on job by 30% more than physical training. I think what we need today is for policymakers to keep pace.
I think just to tie into some of the points that have been raised already around you know, the education gap that we see and how potentially, you know, exploring some of the ideas in terms of how we might solve that. And I think it may be important to think about the fact that ultimately there is, in some ways, a generational disjoint as well when we look at this. And I think from an education standpoint, in terms of how you try to solve that, we need to think about that in terms of how that interplay happens both ways. And I think it does tie into the, you know, the wonderful analogy that the lady gave earlier. And I think if we think about the fact that, you know, the generations that are coming through today are generally digital natives. I mean, when I was young, the internet was some R&D research project at DARPA, and today it's, you know, it's a globally distributed network, you know, infrastructure that we all use on a daily basis. And I think, you know, as you know, the gentleman said, in terms of the pace of technology innovation and how it is becoming much more rapid, we need to also understand that for the generations that are coming up, that are immersed in these technologies from a much younger age, are more familiar with how these technologies have more deeply penetrated our societies and the trends in which how they will continue to move. And I think from our perspective, I think our responsibility, you know, within our generation is more to give them and equip them with the foundational knowledge to be able to take those pieces, put them together and solve the problems in the world that they see and how that might evolve.
Brilliant, thank you. Lord Clement, you've been trying to speak for a while.
Yeah, I just wanted to wildly agree on the education point. I'm going to disagree in a minute with the digital native aspect, actually, but on the education front, I mean, I think what some of us, and certainly our Department for Education in the UK has tended to focus on overly much, is that you need to have, you know, masses more education on coding and so on and so forth. Now, that's all very important, but we do need those creative skills, we need critical thinking, we need communication skills, because we are going to need to understand and learn how to work with artificial intelligence, work with the new technologies, and see how it augments what we do. We need to understand all of that. So that's extremely important. The bit that I disagree with is the digital native aspect, because, you know, at the moment we've got an online harms white paper which is in front of us in Parliament, and, you know, the fact is that if it's opaque and you know, our algorithms, for instance, are not explainable, they're not transparent, you know, it is pretty difficult, even if you are a young digital native person, to understand exactly what is happening. So actually, I think all of us need greater digital understanding. We need a greater degree of digital literacy, and that isn't just tech, it's actually understanding how you're being manipulated as well.
I think it's interesting, though, that I think the younger generation actually are more aware. I mean, I'm talking kids, like, you know, in their teenagers, they know they're being manipulated. I mean, they're absolutely post-image. You know, you show them a photograph of something happening, they know it can be manipulated. You show them an audio recording. Nothing is inherently true about the material world to these kids in a way that is, I think, still pretty shocking to most of us.
It's interesting because we've been sort of talking about two things. One is the virtual world, and then there is the physical world. And I think as humans, ultimately the physical world, the ability to be able to connect is never going to go away. And when time and distance is no longer a barrier, then how would that affect us? How would that change the world? What opportunity would that create? And Lord Clarence and Lord Rees over there mentioned about inequality. How do we readdress? How do we balance? I'll give you an example. I mean, if you look at India as an example, 30 people per minute migrate because of work from the rural areas into the big tier 1 cities. Currently, the population of those tier 1 cities in India is about 300 million. It's by 2030, it'll be 600 million. Yeah? Now, if those people did not have to commute or leave home, change their lives, give up everything that probably is precious to them, they can stay where they are but still have the opportunity to earn a living. That's what technology to me is about. This is what we're really doing, and everything that we're doing now is got to change the way people and their lives, that opportunity will give them. So for us, when we look at it, we look at, well, what happens to cities of the future? Will we carry on planning cities the way we plan cities right now? Where we have, sort of a one-size-all-fits approach. Actually, it's Victorian when we think about it. Yeah? Imagine cities are for people. Imagine you could have manufacturing distribution centers 200-300 kilometers away. Yeah? But there is no barrier. There's no sort of impediment. I think that is when really, I think, we start putting technology together. And fascinating as Hyperloop is, I mean, I've been there a number of years now. Technology again, and Silicon Valley, it's amazing for crossing over. We started in chips and computers, but all of a sudden now it's physical. And how is technology going to affect the physical world? And I think that's where we're heading right now. And I think Hyperloop has got a huge part to play as we go forward.
Before we sum up, just a few questions from here, and then I want to hear from some artists. It feels like it's gone a bit legislative. So, and we've got a hand over there. Okay, we'll do you, sir, then you, and then you, please.
Sure. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Ahmad AlAttar. I'm a PhD student studying robotics and artificial intelligence at the Robot Intelligence Lab in Imperial College London. And I've heard a few comments from some of our guests here at the Majlis that they fear from robots, and they say that robots will take over one day. And as a practicing roboticist, I can say that we have some of the most friendliest robots in our lab. I'm not sure, but if you guys made it to the Great Exhibition Road Festival, which was just a few days ago, we exhibited some of our robots there for 6 hours a day for Saturday and Sunday. Throughout those 6 hours a day, we had children interacting with some of our robots in a friendly way, but I always had the emergency stop button in my hand. So it is very important, I think, that we always have the emergency stop button in our hands. So we must always stay, like your point, we must always stay the master and the robot must stay the servant.
Agree with what's been said, that we need to worry about keeping humans in the loop properly, and also about regulation. And to go back, I think we do need to worry, because it is so easy for just a few people, as in cyber attacks, etc., to disable or distort what the robots do. And I think this is going to be a real challenge, and it's going to be a big tension between privacy, security, and liberty in all countries in the future. We haven't said much about politics and economics, and I think as a follow-up to what you said about the off button, etc., I think we really are always going to want human beings to look after us when we're old. The robots can help, but we want human beings. And also we want kids to be read stories by real people who can emotionally engage, not just by robots. And there's a crying shortage in this country and most countries of people who are paid to care for the old people, etc. And so this just means that we do need a system whereby one can tax heavily these large companies which are raking off all the funds from these advances. And, in my view, have a sort of massive socialist redistribution. So this funding is used to set up huge numbers of jobs for carers for old people, teachers, assistants, and all the rest. And this is a win-win situation because the people being displaced by robots are, for instance, those in Amazon warehouses, those in call centres. And if they can be given dignified, secure work as carers or teachers' assistants, then that's win-win. But that won't happen without the right politics and the willingness to tax very heavily and redistribute in a very serious way.
Marco, you had your hand up earlier, by the way. I just would like to, I'm trying to move this conversation around a little bit just to get some people who are from the creative side. You've been listening to this for the last sort of hour and a bit.
Since you asked.
Since I asked.
I'm working on a project. One of the projects I'm working on for next year is with the Mitterrand Library in Paris, and they've opened a digital building across the street from the largest library in Europe, basically. And it's a very impractical building. The building is shaped like 4 books. So it takes 30 minutes to access a book physically within the library. So you enter your search on a computer, and then there's a conveyor system that looks like it's from the movie Brazil. I don't know if anyone saw that film, but the books actually come on a trolley in the basement and to the person wanting to do the research. And the digital building across the street obviously represents the future and the digital future. So what we're doing with this project is I'm taking all the searches from one day in the library physically and beaming them across the street onto the digital facade, which is a series of giant LED screens. But it's in the process of transmission, the digital transmission, which is essentially physically just across the street. All the data is recombined and put together with machine learning to create patterns within the searches. And then each day, after it appears on the digital building, we print out the recombined data onto paper, and then it goes back into the library and back into the archives. So it creates a kind of closed loop between digital and analog. And it kind of questions the idea of what is meaning, how is meaning transformed through distribution. And I think that's very relevant with both machine learning and social media, where what is true, what is context, how does context affect the meaning of things. And Ez's work, especially for the Expo, deals with something like that as well, where recombination of information creating an expression which is ultimately original, but it's democratic and original at the same time. And I think technology is very important to do that. Fair to speak for you, but is that...
Yeah, I'd like to just move us a little bit on to something that was touched on earlier, which was how to communicate. I think you both touched on the fact that there's a conversation that goes on here, but how do we communicate it beyond this beautiful tent? And we were touching on recently the extraordinary work of Attenborough. And why is it that those films about those animals have communicated perhaps more than any other initiative to communicate climate change, have actually resonated with people and have got actions and practices to change globally in a way that no amount of preaching could? And I think it's because Attenborough uses ancient theatrical techniques. So the man comes from a theatre family, and he uses underscoring. When you look at those films, you've got Hans Zimmer, who has underscored everything from Star Wars to Dunkirk to anything else, underscoring the plight of a turtle crossing the road. And that has actually probably shifted behavior globally around plastics more than any other form. And it is theatre. It's us empathizing with those animals because of all those very carefully calibrated theatrical techniques of storytelling. And we're going to need that to communicate any of these rather abstract conditions and problems that we have to communicate.
It's almost back to the empathy issue, because that narrative, it's based on human qualities, and whether we sympathize and understand and so on, and that's what makes us human, and that's how narrative can get to us. And it's all part of the, of how we've got to make sure that we do treat people as humans and not just simply assume they're going to accept new technology just because it happens to be useful.
Could I pick up on the idea of the narrative and storytelling? It's very interesting. When I kind of think about the near future, and all these things are possible today. and will be possible very shortly, which weren't around 20 years ago. But there are things which I sort of knew about already, and I think maybe all of us did, because we'd seen them in 80s science fiction films, or we'd read about them in sort of 60s science fiction novels, you know, Arthur C. Clarke and so on. You know, technologists aren't necessarily the most creative people. The science fiction writers were, you know, or if we look further back, Tsiolkovsky, who imagined the space race, this Russian cosmologist, but also kind of transhumanist and so on. William Gibson imagined everything ahead of all this. So it feels like we should be investing in the imaginations of people, and from people from a wider variety of backgrounds. So kind of predominant science fiction narrative is a kind of white Western male kind of dialogue. And if we could imagine what would a female African, sub-Saharan African science fiction writer imagine for the future of her world, or a Chinese science fiction writer, and the three-body problem is one of the kind of new science fiction novels from China. So I think it's funny, it's like a kind of, it's the evolutionary soup that kind of breeds future technology, the world of written word and creativity and human imagination. All we're doing is kind of solidifying that stuff, actually, now. I mean, it's disappointing just to say that, but I just like to see more voices in the story of what the future could be.
But computers were always demonized in the science fiction of, you know, from everything from 2001, Space Odyssey, to Colossus, all those cautionary tales about a centralized computer that's going to enslave mankind. And now we have the opposite, where we're sharing it, we're creating a hive.
But yes, but sometimes it's sort of happened as well that, you know, Facebook is a form of, I'm enslaved by Instagram.
Right.
And I wish I wasn't. I can lose 20 minutes of my day, which I could easily. I could be watching my kids, but I've sort of missed that. And so it does feel like it's happening, and it's just the beginning.
To storytelling, I've seen a few hands up. Let's get some of your thoughts from that, and please just go ahead and dive in after each other so we can speed it up a little bit and get everyone's voices heard.
So mine wasn't really about storytelling, but really this notion of the fourth industrial revolution, to throw down a challenge and say, do we really want a fourth industrial revolution? The first three have moved us as a species enormously from where we used to be, but they've brought all these challenges that we face today: climate change, pollution, unequal societies, and so forth. And maybe we're standing at a point now where if we thought differently and we didn't think about this being the fourth wave of something we're already familiar with, but a true kind of revolution in terms of how we collaborate, how we address the challenges we have, we could really build a better future for everybody.
Since we're talking about technology, we touched base with Mirror World, and then we went to policy, and then we touched about health. I just want to go back to maybe Asif Khan quick and Rob. Suppose that you're doing architecture, you're transforming public spaces, physical space. What does that entail if this space becomes a virtual space in terms of access to others? So now the internet is, there's more people who don't have internet today than the people who have access. Think about those with the likes of SpaceX and the other projects that will, Project X, I think, where you would have internet for everyone. But travel is still a limitation. Travel is still expensive for those who actually can't travel. And transformation of a physical space, what does that mean in terms of a mirror world?
I mean, I don't have the answer, because it's something evolving at present, but I think everyone has probably walked around with Apple earphones whilst having a WhatsApp conversation with someone from 3,000, 5,000 miles away, and you're spending your day with them, you know, for 2 or 3 hours, whilst walking around a park or something in London. And I think that will happen extensively within Expo, where, you know, and it's, as long as people have fast enough signals. I kind of, the idea of people being better connected together who were previously separated is something fantastic. It's something wonderful, especially with the kind of global diaspora, the migration that's happening, the climate change there. We're human beings are nomadic, and this technology enables us to remain nomadic, which I think is sort of in our nature. And I think public space, how public space remains universal and truly public is the kind of the great challenge of the future, really. So that it's seen as some vital resource for human beings rather than real estate. So I think this is sort of, the internet also has that same challenge in a way. It has to feel like public space or commons, as opposed to feeling like it's commodified and sort of it's advertising space for our minds, you know. So they face the same challenges.
Okay. Anyone like to add? Go for it.
I think just it's really interesting to see how technology as an enabler in terms of kind of connecting people and bringing them together really does start to, I suppose, over time, decouple concepts of kind of community from geography. And I think as we look at kind of how virtual worlds are evolving and how you know, people are becoming much more engaged in them, I can quite easily see a future where there's an economic element that kind of plays into that. And if you look at technologies like blockchain, which is very good at providing a way to, in a very decentralized way, in a trustless way, bring value, so real value, and kind of translate that into a kind of digitized form. And I think it's interesting to understand how, you know, we will see the growth of sort of intangible economies online, where essentially, you know, people will maintain their entire livelihood through, you know, engaging in virtual worlds and virtual environments where they're connecting with people from all over the world versus, you know, the world that we live in today. So.
One point to make really about the converse nature of technology. We all talk about the fourth industrial revolution. It's been 4 years since that was kind of discussed in Davos by Klaus Schwab. We're 4 years on, but actually the world's a nastier place. We're more divided. There's more rise of the far right around the world. We are having fake news. We're arguing, we're fighting, we're warring. So has technology actually helped us in any shape or form in the last 4 years? That's my question. We all think it's going to be an enabler. It's going to cure all of our ills. It's made the world a worse place at the moment. So my question is, how do we reverse that? How do we persuade technology to do much better good? Whether it's a video of which happened, I don't know, whatever it is. We're fundamentally not answering the questions that we've posed ourselves. Technology needs to be used in a different way to perhaps make us kinder beings overall.
I mean, I agree with that. I'm very, enthusiastic about the greater connection and using technology for a more sustainable world, and I think that's really important. But we have to recognise, things like the internet haven't all been beneficial, and that we need to make sure that this technology is for the benefit of society and it is safe. But also the new dimension really is the autonomous aspect of artificial intelligence. A lot of these other technologies are not autonomous, and it's when it begins to have a life of its own, in a sense, in quotes. I'm sure Martin would find that use of language far too inexact. But, that's the new dimension where we really do have to understand what its purpose is and what the, if you like, the ethical framework surrounding it is. And perhaps also the legal system around it as well.
I think that's why, though, it's important to get beyond this master-slave dichotomy. I mean, we often talk about it's important for people to remain the master of technology, but that political framing hasn't worked out so well for us in the last couple hundred years. And as we start to talk about autonomous systems, I'm not talking about general artificial intelligence, but systems that have some degree of independence and or authority or power over us, the relationship should not be one of who's the master, who's the slave, and how do we exert control therein. I think we've done a lot of research around this in the Museum of the Future about trying to identify this as a sort of interwoven relationship of mutual responsibility, rights, obligations, and commitments as one has in a family. You don't say you're the master of your child. Your child is not your slave. You have rights and responsibilities to it, and it has rights and responsibilities to you, and you exist in some hour's debate coming. But it's an important framing that the artists lead the way on, because this is not a post-colonial future with robots that we're trying to move into here. This is not a colonial future, I should say.
Perhaps we should not have a stop button. I'd like to argue that we are biased nations are biased, and the reason Theodore Roosevelt, somebody mentioned earlier, came here was because we wanted to avoid an event in our life that would be repeated and potentially put the framework and the right guidelines. So if the machine is making the decision with the right framework and the right guidelines, you perhaps would want that instead of a biased individual or a biased nation to have the control.
I just wonder, taking into account climate change, the temperatures we've seen around Europe this week, which are in 46 degrees in Montpellier or something like this, it's the highest temperatures ever, and then also the kind of remarkable speed and progress of technology and the kind of fears that we have. From a storytelling perspective, if you're an outside observer, would this story have a happy ending? Do we kind of all end up kind of winning, or is there some terrible catastrophe ahead of us? Quite obviously, like, you know what happens at the end of this film. I don't even need to watch it. And if knowing that, what could we do now as individuals, as groups, to kind of change the ending of the film?
Martin's going to answer, I can tell.
Yes. Well, I think we could and should do a lot to prevent those scenarios, and it's not just climate, it's misuse of these technologies. I want to make another point, actually stimulated by what you said about us becoming nomadic. I think human nature has not changed for thousands of years. It may change in the next 100 or two, not through AI, but through genetic modification, it may. But for the moment, we're the same. And it's not at all obvious that it's better to be nomadic than to be settled in some small town or community. We were nomadic until a few thousand years ago, and then people became more settled, and now, in a sense, they're becoming nomadic. But is it a good thing? Aren't people perhaps happier if they are in a small, real community of Dunbars, 150 people, etc., rather than just having random connections with people all over the world, which are more transient?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on this point about nomadic and Martin's riposte to it, because let's just remember the Greek word oikos. It led to these two critical words in our time at the moment, eco-logos, oikos-logos, ecology, and oikos-nomos, economy. So ecology is studying our home. Eco is our home. Studying our home. And economy is managing our home. And I asked this question last night. Martin heard me ask it in front of a group of people, and I will ask it again. We currently have economies that have to grow whether or not societies thrive. And what we need are economies which ensure that societies thrive whether or not they grow.
And on that note, I'd like to invite Noah Raford to just do a quick summing up of what you think of the whole event.
No pressure,
just
thanks.
Your thoughts. It's all right, I'll do the summing up, it's fine.
Right, well, that's a nigh impossible task. I'm privileged to have the chance to have these kind of conversations with communities like this around the world, and I think this is definitely one of the better ones. And one of the things that emerges is this tension between having a sense of personal agency in relationship to the future and the need for human beings to be involved in that process. That's not something which experts tell us. And then also the very real need of managing our affairs of house, as it were, just to use the acoustics example, oikos, which by necessity doesn't necessarily involve individuals. This involves things like managing our carbon budget, things like perhaps legislating against rampant genetic modification, et cetera. And that tension is very real and very profound around the world. And what strikes me is that there is no right answer. We're not at an age in our civilization in which, for example, when the UAE was founded, we can look to others who have the right answer. You can't look to the UK for an education system. You can't look to America for a healthcare system, as bad of an idea that might be. Because everyone around the world is struggling with these questions. And they're questions which are based on values, which are expressed based on our expression of what kind of world do we want to live in. And those are questions which are non-optimal. They're not to be optimized. It's a question of emotion, of feeling, of the kind of social value that we want to participate in. And so in that sense, it's tremendously exciting because it gives us a chance to be writing the story of the future. And the Expo is such a wonderful location to do that in because it brings together in an urban realm, in a face-to-face experience, in slightly larger than a Dunbar's number, but in a human relationship, the chance to see people from different walks of life, people from different philosophical, religious, social backgrounds, all expressing and commenting on each other's positions and opinions on the future. And that's quite beautiful. I think towards Najib's point earlier, this is needed now more than ever. And it's not, I think, inconsequential that it's happening in the UAE, which is this extraordinary global crossroads of, let us say, the West and the East, the North and the South, the old and the new, the religious and the secular, all being brought together in quite a tolerant and open way. So whilst it's terrifying, you know, climate change, AI, jobless futures, pandemics, etc., it's also extraordinarily exciting because there is no right answer, and it's up to us to really design that in the great sort of crossing the river by feeling for stones metaphor that Deng used to use. So it's a rare opportunity. I think that all of these comments here from the panels and from the students touches on these in quite a profound way, and it's certainly on par with any, if not exceeding any conversation that I've had around this nature with others in the world. So thank you.
Brilliant. So what we've kind of gathered, I've tried to make a few notes whilst listening to everybody. We've talked about the future, government, society, ethics, AI, creativity, storytelling, and a whole host of other things. And the things that have come out of this from my sort of ears have been finding ways to engage people who might feel disenfranchised. Maybe like a sustainable development goals equivalent for technology, like and keeping the conversation going. And I've also put down here education, not just for people who are disengaged, but for us, for each other, being willing to learn. Somebody else's culture may feel different to you, but it doesn't mean that you're right and they're wrong, or even the other way around. It's understanding that we have one point of view, and perhaps in the virtual world we get to step into others and listen. And not just coding, learning to code, but problem solving, critical thinking. All of these things are a fantastic skill set. I put here a starter pack for empathy. If children are taught self-esteem, critical thinking, empathy, thought, and kindness alongside, you know, more traditional things like spelling, it might make for a more interesting experience when you start interacting in the workplace and creating a culture that thrives on helping each other. You know, like the happiness index, but for sort of technological advancement. So I think it just sort of remains really for me to thank everybody for their participation, the observers who were also participants, as well as the observers themselves. I want to conclude by saying a giant thank you also for having me and for your attention, and I'm going to hand over to Najib now for some final words. But thank you all very much. Give yourselves a round of applause. I think you deserve it.
So my invitation for all of you is to actually see you all during the Expo next year in Dubai. And my request from every one of you is to be able, we have great minds in this room alone, great experiences in this Majlis. And I would imagine brilliant networks that every single one of you actually have, to send this message forward for us to be able to do a change. We're not going to be able to solve all the problems and the issues that we discussed today in Expo 2020, but we can take steps forward. And we can use it, and we can only use it and make something really progressively forward if we have everybody engaged. To go back into what we said in the beginning of the Majlis, 192 nations so far have committed. People from all walks of life will be part of this Expo. 172 days of discussions, 172 days of opportunities, taking things forward. The more we can take the message forward from today, the better chance we actually have to make a difference with our Expo in 2020. And with this, I would like to really thank every single one of you and your time and your patience and your contributions to this Majlis. Thank you very much.